Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the 1920s. I'm sitting here with my dog on this rainy day. Um, so, what we're going to do today is look at how the 1920s became this idea of the roaring 20s. So, the idea of World War One kind of changing us in the 1920s. We're going to look at the mass production of goods today and how that affected Americans into those 1920s. And we're also going to be looking at the effects on migration and settlement patterns. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is tie up one thing from World War One, and that is the Treaty of Versailles. And Wilson, President Wilson, when he came into the Treaty of Versailles, he came in with what he called his 14 points. And what he wanted to do was he wanted the U.S. to help spread democracy around the world, and by doing that, he would have to lessen the control of the European countries on the world affairs. Most of the European countries were not interested in that. They ended up blaming Germany for the war and making Germany pay huge reparations to the war. One of his most important points that we end up ignoring is the League of Nations. He wanted to create the League of Nations to allow the world to avoid any future problems, such as World War One. The problem was the U.S. Senate refused to ratify that treaty, and they refused to join the League of Nations. So I asked the question here, what precedent in American foreign policy would lead the Senate to not want to get involved in the League of Nations? Anybody have an answer? Think about it. Okay, so we've had a foreign policy of isolationism dating all the way back to Washington's farewell address. There you see him saying, don't get involved in problems. Well, if we get involved in the League of Nations, we're going to get involved in everybody's problems. So the Senate rejected the treaty, they rejected the League of Nations, and without us, you can see here the bridge to all these places designed by us, but here we are, Uncle Sam there, sitting out away, and we happen to be the most important part of this. Without us, the ascendant superpower in the world, this whole thing was doomed from the start. Another way to look at it is here you notice the different world powers. They're going across the eastern hemisphere, which you can see all the different places here, and they're spreading the seeds of a future war. So with our failure to join, we definitely led, or that definitely led to the idea that World War II was almost inevitable. However, starting with the 1920 election, Warren Harding, who got elected, promised to return to what he called normalcy. In fact, his quote was, America's present need is not heroics, but healing. No nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration. And this term normalcy right now would be really nice. Normalcy for us would be returning to school, being able to go to the grocery store and buy, toilet paper and things like that. Well, for America in the 1920s, what did normalcy mean? What did that mean after World War One? What did that mean after the Progressive period? And what that means for us today is, or back in 1920 is, let's return to the things and how they were going, in the 1880s and 1890s. Let's get government out of people's lives. Let's make a smaller government. Let's get rid of all these major problems and let the economy boom, like it was in the late 1800s. Our isolationism was selective, however. We did hold conferences to try to get all nations to reduce their militaries voluntarily. It had mixed effects, but our idea was if we could get those militaries away, we could prevent future wars. Not really. And then down here is the more important thing. We did loan billions of dollars to help rebuild nations after World War I, specifically France and Germany. And for some, that was controversial because Germany was blamed for the war after all. These were called circular loans, and you can see that on the next slide here. We would lend money to Germany. Germany, in return, who had to pay reparations for the damages of World War I, would pay the other Allied powers, so France, England, those types of countries, and they would repay that with the money that we lent them. You notice that it's not the total, so they can use some of that money to rebuild Germany. And then the Allies, who loaned money from us during the war, would then pay us back using those payments. So even though we were giving money out, it was making its way back to us. So that'll be important later in the Great Depression. We'll talk about that. All right, switching gears a little bit, the technology of the 1920s. The 1920s were a really cool time because we start seeing some modern day things here. And what starts happening is people start focusing on these new technologies that would be producing consumer goods. So as we talked about in the last unit, there was a rise in the middle class. Well, in the 1920s, we're going to see more and more technologies be focused on that middle class. So they create the first vacuum cleaners. They create the first washing machines, and I'll show you pictures here in a second. The first irons. So you no longer had to put a hot piece of metal on a fire. You could actually plug in your iron. Gas ovens, other things like refrigerators or ice boxes is what they would call them. Before that, you don't have to have ice bread anymore. You can actually plug in a refrigerator. Toasters, things like that. We also see an impact on mobility. For the first time, cars become affordable. People are buying cars in great numbers. Gas stations start spreading out. Gas is actually available. Mass transit. There actually used to be a rail transit between like Bloomington, Champaign, Decatur, Springfield. It's gone now, but people could get on those and easily and cheaply travel. We also see better communication systems. Radio is widely available. Telephones are widely available. Many different things to help people communicate rapidly, which is going to help the economy as well. So here we see in the top left one of the first washing machines with attached dryer. And if you don't know what that is, that gives you put your clothes in there and you squeeze the water out. So you feed your clothes to the middle of that, and then the water gets squeezed back into the washing machine. You see an oven here, kind of a gas oven like you would see today. Little storage on the side. Sorry, my dog is moving around here. First power tools. There's an early refrigerator. You see on the top is what would keep things cool. This is a toaster, very dangerous because they had all the heating elements exposed. And then, of course, telephones, waffle irons, that thing, and then just irons as well. And I forgot what I searched when I put that in. So there you go. All right. Also see radios. Oh, okay, Daisy, calm down. Ow. All right, so we see radios for the first time. We have some of the first movie stars. You guys probably have heard of Charlie Chaplin, rocking that Hitler mustache. Al Jolson and the jazz singer, which we're going to look at in a minute here. And then, of course, we see the first silent movies come out before this. We see the first talkies. And again, the term movies was because you couldn't hear anybody, so you saw them moving. Well, the talkies, when you start seeing people talk, that's because they were talking. That term does not stick when we go back to movies, but it's weird when you think about, like, oh my goodness, it was a movie because they're moving and a talkie because it's talking. So let's take a look at a movie and then a talkie. So here's a Charlie Chaplin movie called The Circus, and this is a little scene from that. So let's take a look. Uh-oh. Now, oftentimes these movies would be accompanied with like a live orchestra in the movie theaters. Okay, so you get the idea of a movie, and we're going to look at the first ever talkie that came out in 1927. This is called The Jazz Singer. I'm only going to show you a portion of this, but you're going to see the first text, and it's kind of a weird mix of a silent movie and a talkie.
Wonderful pals are always hard to find.
So
Some folks have one,
hard to believe that this is
some
like
folks have
revolutionary, but it is. So in that movie, there was some unfortunate things that were happening towards the end of the movie. That actor, his name is Al Jolson, shows up in blackface to perform. Now, a lot of people, I mean, it's not good. A lot of people kind of really look down on this today, and they look back at Al Jolson doing this in the first talkie movie and see it that way. But Al Jolson was known to be wanting to be exposing the African American culture to the rest of the world. A lot of movie theaters wouldn't allow African Americans to be on screen. A lot of theaters wouldn't allow them to perform, which we'll talk a little bit about that on the next video. But so for Jolson, he was being an early advocate for African Americans. Today we look at this and obviously look at this as highly racist. So here you can see this here for just a minute.
Mammy, the sunshine beat, the sunshine wet, but I know where the sunshine's best. Mammy, Mammy.
And that's about all that I can take. But there you go, from the same movie as the other club. Okay, so the effects of that new technology, the mass media, so the radio and movies, contributed to the spread of a new national culture. You can think of this today as like when you watch TV, It doesn't matter if you're in California or Texas or Illinois or Maine. We're all watching the same TV shows, the same movies. In fact, it's really kind of a global thing at this point. Well, what that does for the United States is it starts to erase some of those sectional boundaries. So the divide that helped lead to the Civil War, those things start to go away as we conform to one mass culture. That'll be pushed further later in American history with the advent of television. We also see these different migration and settlement patterns of the 1920s. This is where we're going to end. So we're going to go through a few of those migration patterns and take a look, and then that'll be it for today. There was increased urbanization, and you can see that the 1920s start right in this time period here. By the end of the 1920s, a majority of Americans are, or at least half, are living in cities. And you can see that's been an ongoing process going all the way back. But here we've reached, by the end of the 1920s, we've reached half of the American population in cities. So we can say, see you later to Jefferson's view of us as a rural country. And as you notice over time, that number just keeps increasing and increasing. So that all kind of, that reaches its zenith in the 1920s. So some effects of that increased urbanization. Number one, women had more job opportunities. Remember, on the farm, that was very limited. When they go to the cities, they do find new jobs. Now, we call these pink-collar jobs because they were still not able to do every job that they wanted to do. So we're talking about like teachers in a lot of the new schools that were being made, nurses, secretaries, jobs that you would consider like typically women would fill them. Those are the jobs women are finding in factories, but they are finding jobs, or for the most part before that, there were no jobs available to them, or at least they were very limited. Other migrant groups also see more jobs. As we talked about before, all those new things that people are wanting to buy, well, you got to have more factories for those things. And more factories mean more jobs. And not just the line worker jobs, but also those middle management jobs that we were talking about in the last unit that created a new middle class. So the 1920s sees a growth in that middle class again. And that middle class means more people spending more money on consumer goods. If I'm in the middle class, I can afford a washing machine. I can afford a car. I can get those things that I want. So they kind of push each other, so to speak. As has been the case, of course, anytime we see a new wave of immigrants, there is an anti-immigrant or nativist response. So one of the things that pushed this was during 1917, the Russians had a communist revolution, and Eastern Europeans were the ones that were coming over to the United States in large numbers. So we go through our first Red Scare, and that eventually leads to the Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted immigration to 2 to 3% of the population from each country in 1890. So whatever the population was of Italians in 1890, they would take 2 to 3% of that, and that would be how many people could immigrate in a given year, or whatever country. So what would be that impact on Southern and Eastern Europe? Well, they weren't immigrating really in large numbers before that time period, so you're going to severely limit those while not limiting your Germans, your French, your English people like that. The 1924 Act also reaffirmed zero immigration from Asian countries, not just China anymore, but Japan included, which Japan held some Hate America rallies, which cool, I guess. So here's a look at that. Often used image on the AP test. You notice that Europeans are wanting to come over for the new opportunities in the United States, but we're putting up a gate there, and it says 3% here. We're putting up that gate so very few of them can get through. Other people were not just the only ones migrating. We also see African American migration in the 1920s. Starts during World War I, what we call the Great Migration, and runs through roughly the 1970s. Approximately 6 million Americans moved from the South to the North and the West, not just the North. They were looking for jobs, and they were looking to escape the bad conditions in the South, such as the segregation and racism, the lynchings, things like that. So you see they're heading up in large numbers to urban areas in the North. We notice Chicago is pointed out here, St. Louis, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, those areas. They're all heading up to northern urban centers and also out to the west. So you see San Francisco, Oakland, LA, Phoenix, Portland, Seattle. They're not a lot of them are stopping along the way. They're getting all the way out there. Decatur, right smack dab in the middle of Illinois here. We're affected by that. A large part of our African American population came from the city of Brownsville, Tennessee. In fact, some of you might have, you might actually have relatives or ancestors that still live in Brownsville, Tennessee. So if you ask your mom and dad, you're home, so ask. But that's the Great Migration. That's where a lot of the northern African American population comes from in this time period. I believe the African American population in Decatur came up in the 1940s and 50s. So you can see this is the percent of African Americans living in the American South, about 90% for most of American history. And you notice right here in 1920, we start to see that number drop, and it starts dropping significantly past that time. Families would take everything they own to get out. So here you see a family packed everything they own, which, can you imagine, that's all you got? But that's what they had. And then oftentimes wearing their best clothes to make a good impression when they get there. So here's your family. And I love this kid posing here. This is they would oftentimes take train stations as well. This is a picture from the, unfortunately, segregated colored waiting room. But you can see they've packed their bags and they're leaving with whatever they've got. So what we see here, because of this African American migration, northern whites were being exposed to African American culture. It had some good effects and some bad. A lot of people began to hear African American music and see African Americans for the first time, which did help break down some barriers. Jazz became the most popular form of music during the time. In fact, this is also referred to as the Jazz Age. Well, that came from African American culture in the South. Without that migration and the new technologies, it may not have been easy for jazz to become that popular. There were others that reacted negatively, though. We see the resurgence of the KKK in this time period. The 1920s saw the largest resurgence of the KKK, started in Indiana, which is a typically northern state. So the KKK does come back. We see lynchings in the north as well. It's not all positive. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop for today. Tim, the next video, we're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance and what that looks like for African Americans in the 1920s. Thanks for tuning in.